The flames danced in Violet Gardner's eyes as she stared into the crowd of men throwing coins at her feet, their faces twisted with desire and cruelty. The year was 1876, and for a woman with no family and few options in the harsh reality of Santa Rosa, New Mexico territory, survival meant dancing for the pleasure of others, no matter how much it broke her spirit. Violet wiped the sweat from her brow as she twirled on the worn wooden stage of the Golden Horseshoe Saloon. The scent of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies filled the air. Her feet ached in the cheap dancing shoes she'd mended 3 times over. Her red dress, once vibrant, now faded from too many washings, clung to her slender frame as she moved to the tinny piano melody. "Faster, girl. Give 'em what they paid for," hollered Silas Blackburn, the saloon owner who kept her indebted to him through a combination of threats and manipulation. 3 years ago, when she was 18 and newly orphaned, he'd offered her work as a serving girl. But soon enough, he'd forced her onto the stage, claiming she owed him for room and board. "Dance, pretty thing," a miner shouted, tossing a coin that struck her ankle painfully. Violet maintained her smile, the one she'd perfected that never quite reached her eyes. Her long brown hair had come loose from its pins, cascading down her back as she spun again, her skirts flaring out. She refused to look directly at any of the men. Instead, she focused on a point above their heads, imagining herself far away dancing in a meadow, free from the grabbing hands and leering stares. The piano player, Old Pete, finished the song with a flourish. Violet curtsied as coins clattered onto the stage. Silas appeared immediately, using his boot to sweep the money toward himself while keeping a tight grip on Violet's arm. "Not bad tonight," he muttered, pocketing the earnings. "But you could do better. Try showing more leg tomorrow." Violet pulled away from his grasp. "You got what you wanted, Silas. Let me rest now." "1 more hour," he ordered, his breath hot and sour against her face. "And smile more. Men don't pay to see a sour face." As she turned to climb back on stage, the saloon doors swung open. The crowd parted as a tall figure stepped through, silhouetted against the setting sun. The newcomer moved with quiet confidence, dust from the trail still clinging to his clothes. As he stepped into the lamplight, Violet saw a man unlike the usual patrons, his face clean-shaven, his clothes worn but well kept. His eyes, bright blue beneath the brim of his hat, surveyed the room before settling on her. Flynn Nolan had ridden into Santa Rosa that afternoon, his horse tired from the long journey from Colorado. He'd come to deliver a herd of cattle and intended to rest before heading back north. The Golden Horseshoe was the only establishment still lit up as evening fell. He'd expected the usual cards, whiskey, perhaps some conversation. What he hadn't expected was the woman on stage, dancing with such resignation in her eyes that it stopped him in his tracks. She danced beautifully, her movements graceful despite her obvious fatigue, but it was the sorrow beneath her practiced smile that caught his attention. Flynn made his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey while keeping his eyes on the dancer. "Who's the girl?" he asked the barkeep. "That's Violet." "Owner's prized possession," the man replied, sliding a glass toward Flynn. "Brings in more money than the whiskey most nights. She don't look happy to be here." The barkeep snorted. "What gave it away? Not many girls dream of dancing for drunks in a place like this." Flynn watched as Violet began another dance, her movements mechanical now. A man reached out, attempting to grab her ankle as she twirled past the edge of the stage. She avoided him deftly, but Flynn noticed the fear that flickered across her face. "How long's she been here?" Flynn asked, his voice hardening. "Few years. Came as a serving girl, now she dances." The barkeep shrugged. "Silas says she owes him. Always seems to owe him. no matter how much she earns. Flynn had seen such arrangements before debt peonage that amounted to little more than slavery. It wasn't uncommon in the territories where law was thin and desperate people had few protections. As the night wore on, Flynn nursed his drink and observed. He noticed how Silas collected every coin thrown Violet's way. He saw the way the other girls serving drinks or sitting with customers cast sympathetic glances toward Violet when Silas wasn't looking. And he saw the exhaustion in Violet's eyes grow with each dance. When Violet finally left the stage, her face glistening with sweat and her hands trembling slightly, Flynn watched as she disappeared through a side door. Moments later, Silas followed. Flynn paid for his drink and made his way casually toward that same door. Outside, in the narrow alley beside the saloon, he heard voices, Silas's low, threatening growl and Violet's quieter responses. $50 short this week, Silas was saying. You think I run a charity? I danced every night, Violet replied, her voice steady despite its softness. I can't make them throw more money, Silas. Maybe you ain't trying hard enough. Maybe you need motivation. Flynn rounded the corner just as Silas raised his hand to strike Violet. In 2 long strides, Flynn was between them, his hand clamping around Silas's wrist. That's not how a man treats a lady, Flynn said quietly. Silas wrenched his arm free, his face twisting with anger. This ain't your business, stranger. The girl works for me. Looks more like slavery from where I'm standing. Flynn stood his ground, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. She owes me money, Silas sputtered. Room and board, clothes, protection, how much? Flynn interrupted. What? How much does she owe? I'll pay it, then she's free to go. Silas laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet night. $300 plus interest. Flynn knew it was a lie, an inflated sum meant to keep Violet trapped. But he didn't blink. I'll get it. Tomorrow morning, and then she walks away free and clear. Silas's eyes narrowed. You got that kind of money, cowboy? I do. Flynn had just been paid for delivering the cattle, a substantial sum that he'd planned to use to expand his small ranch back home. First thing tomorrow. Until then, she's not to be harmed. Silas looked from Flynn to Violet, calculating. Fine. But she stays locked in her room tonight. Can't have my investment running off before I get paid. Flynn nodded curtly. I'll be back at dawn. As Silas stormed back into the saloon, Violet finally spoke to Flynn directly. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Flynn turned to face her. In the moonlight, he could see the delicate curve of her cheek, the wariness in her eyes. Nobody deserves to be owned, he said simply. Least of all someone who dances like they are meant to be free. Violet's expression softened momentarily before hardening again with suspicion. And what will you expect from me once you've paid? To be your property instead? Flynn shook his head firmly. Nothing. You'll be free to go wherever you please. Nobody does something for nothing out here. I'm not asking for anything in return. Flynn adjusted his hat, looking directly into her eyes. I've got a long ride home tomorrow. You're welcome to ride along if you want or stay here in town, your choice. But you'll be free to make that choice. Before Violet could respond, the saloon door opened and Silas reappeared. Inside, Violet. Now. Flynn watched as Violet cast one last uncertain glance his way before disappearing back into the saloon. He stood in the alley for a long moment, wondering if he'd gone mad. $300 was no small sum, almost everything he had. For a woman he'd never even spoken to until moments ago. But as he walked back to his room at the boarding house, Flynn couldn't forget the look in Violet's eyes as she danced like a wild bird in a too small cage, her spirit intact despite her circumstances. Some things, he decided, were worth more than money. Dawn broke clear and cold over Santa Rosa. Flynn had slept little, his mind turning over his impulsive decision. He'd worked hard for that money, saved carefully with plans to add to his small homestead. And now he was about to hand it all over for a stranger. Yet as he counted out the money and tucked it into his vest pocket, he felt no regret, only determination. He'd seen too much injustice in his 30 years, fought in a war that was supposed to end slavery but had somehow left so many still in chains, visible or invisible. The Golden Horseshoe was quiet when Flynn arrived, chairs still stacked on tables from the previous night's cleaning. Silas was behind the bar, counting the till, his face sour in the early light. "Didn't think you'd show," Silas said as Flynn approached. "I gave my word." Flynn placed a stack of bills on the counter. $300. Now where's Miss Gardner? Silas counted the money slowly, his fingers lingering on each bill. Finally, he tucked it into his pocket. "She's upstairs. Room at the end of the hall." Flynn nodded curtly and headed for the stairs. The upper floor was dim, a narrow hallway with several rooms for the girls who worked in the saloon. At the end, he knocked softly. "Miss Gardner, it's Flynn Nolan." The door opened cautiously. Violet stood there, her face pale in the half-light. She'd changed into a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back in a plain knot. A small bag sat on the bed behind her. "You came," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I said I would." Flynn stepped back to give her space. "It's done, you're free to go." Violet stared at him, searching his face for some hidden motive. Just like that, just like that. She glanced back at her meager belongings. "I don't have anywhere to go. Like I said last night, you can ride with me if you want. I'm heading back to Colorado. My ranch is small, but there's a town nearby where you might find work if you choose." Violet hesitated, weighing her limited options. Stay in Santa Rosa, where Silas might find ways to reclaim her, or go with this stranger who'd inexplicably paid for her freedom. "Why are you helping me?" she asked again. Flynn considered his answer carefully. "When I was a boy, my mother used to dance. Not in saloons, just at home when she was happy. After my father died, she stopped. Said the music left her." He met Violet's gaze. "When I saw you dancing last night, I saw someone who still had music inside them, even though everything around you was trying to stamp it out." Violet's expression softened. For the first time since he'd seen her, a genuine smile touched her lips. "I'll go with you," she said quietly. "At least until I figure out what comes next." Flynn nodded, suddenly aware of the rapid beating of his heart. "My horse is at the livery. We can leave whenever you're ready." Violet picked up her bag, everything she owned in the world fitting into one small satchel. "I'm ready now." As they descended the stairs, Silas watched from behind the bar, his expression dark. "You'll be back," he called to Violet. "Girls like you always end up back where they belong." Violet flinched but kept walking. Flynn placed a hand lightly on her back, a silent gesture of support. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean after the stale atmosphere of the saloon. Violet took a deep breath, as if trying to clear her lungs of years of smoke and whiskey fumes. "I haven't been outside this early in years," she admitted as they walked toward the livery. "Silas didn't like us to be seen in daylight unless we were working." Flynn felt anger rise in him at the casual cruelty of her captivity, but kept his expression neutral. "It's a good time of day for starting fresh." At the livery, Flynn's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Rusty, whickered softly in greeting. Flynn paid the stable boy, then set about saddling his mount. "Ever ridden before?" he asked Violet. She nodded. "My father taught me when I was young. We had a farm outside of Kansas City before he died." Flynn adjusted the stirrups to accommodate her shorter legs, then helped her mount behind him. She hesitated briefly before placing her hands lightly on his waist. As they rode out of Santa Rosa, Violet kept looking back, as if expecting Silas to emerge from the saloon and demand her return. But the town gradually receded into the distance, and with each mile, Flynn felt her grip on his waist relax slightly. They rode in companionable silence for most of the morning, the rhythm of the horses hooves a steady backdrop to their thoughts. The landscape of northern New Mexico rolled out before them rugged mesas, patches of pine and juniper, and vast expanses of open country. By midday, they stopped near a small creek to rest and water the horse. Violet slid from the saddle, wincing slightly as her feet touched the ground. Flynn noticed her discomfort. "Dancing shoes aren't made for riding," he observed, offering her his canteen. She accepted it with a small smile. "Nothing I own is really made for anything practical. Silas preferred us to look decorative." Flynn unpacked some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, offering her a share. As they ate their simple meal, he found himself studying her face in the sunlight. Without the heavy rouge and powder she'd worn on stage, her features were delicate but strong high cheekbones, a determined chin, and eyes the color of summer sage. "How far is your ranch?" she asked, breaking the silence. "About 3 days' ride if the weather holds. We'll need to stop in towns along the way for proper meals and rest." Violet nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And when we get there, what then?" Flynn considered the question. In truth, he hadn't thought much beyond getting her away from Silas. "There's a small cabin on my property was meant for a hired hand, but I've been working the place alone. You can stay there until you decide what you want to do next. The nearest town is Willow Creek, about 5 miles from my land. Might be work there if you're looking to settle." "I've never really been able to decide things for myself before," Violet admitted. "It's strange to suddenly have choices." "No rush," Flynn said, repacking their modest provisions. "Sometimes freedom takes getting used to." As they prepared to continue their journey, Violet paused, placing a hand on Flynn's arm. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes meeting his. "I know what it cost you, not just the money." Flynn felt an unexpected warmth spread through him at her touch. "Some things are worth the price," he replied quietly. They remounted and continued north, the vast landscape seemingly endless before them. Violet's presence behind him, the light pressure of her hands at his waist, the occasional brush of her breath against his neck when the trail grew rough, created an unfamiliar intimacy that Flynn found both unsettling and pleasant. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. Flynn studied the sky with concern. "Storm's coming. We should find shelter before it hits." "Is there a town nearby?" Violet asked, her voice close to his ear as she leaned forward to see past his shoulder. "Not for miles. But I know these parts. There's an old line shack about an hour's ride from here. Might not be much, but it'll keep us dry." The wind picked up as they rode, carrying the scent of rain. Flynn urged Rusty to a faster pace, aware of the rapidly darkening sky. They reached the line shack, a small, weathered structure used by cowboys watching over grazing cattle just as the first heavy drops began to fall. The cabin was basic, but sound one room with a small stone fireplace, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the wall. Flynn quickly unsaddled Rusty and led him to a lean-to attached to the back of the shack, while Violet ventured inside. By the time Flynn joined her, the rain was coming down in sheets. He found Violet kneeling at the fireplace, attempting to light a fire with the meager supply of wood stacked beside it. "Here, let me help." Flynn crouched beside her, their shoulders nearly touching as he arranged the kindling. Soon, a small flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the shack. As the fire grew stronger, The chill in the room gradually receded. Flynn rummaged through his saddlebags, producing a small packet of coffee, some beans, and a tin of preserved peaches luxuries he'd been saving for the journey home. "It's not much of a supper," he apologized. Setting the items on the table, Violet shook her head. "It's more than I often got at the saloon. Sela's wasn't one for feeding us well, said it would make us fat." Flynn's jaw tightened at the casual mention of yet another cruelty, but he kept his tone light. "Well, on my ranch, nobody goes hungry, not people, not animals." As they shared their simple meal, the storm intensified, rain drumming on the roof and wind howling around the corners of the shack. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the small space in stark white light, followed by the deep rumble of thunder. "Reminds me of when I was little," Violet said, staring into the fire. "My mother would tell stories during storms to keep me from being afraid." "What kind of stories?" Flynn asked, struck by the softening of her expression at the memory. "Fairy tales, mostly." She loved the ones where people danced. 12 Dancing Princesses was her favorite. She'd say that dancing was how the soul spoke when words weren't enough. Violet's voice grew quieter. "She died when I was 12. Fever took her in less than a week." "I'm sorry," Flynn said softly. "My mother passed when I was 16, left a hole nothing seems to fill." Violet nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And your father never came back from the war, fought for the Union at Gettysburg. I was just a boy then." They fell into silence, the shared experience of loss creating a bridge between them. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. "You should take the cot," Flynn said eventually, nodding toward the narrow bed. "I'll manage on the floor near the fire." Violet glanced at the cot, then back at Flynn. "You've done enough already. I can't take your bed too." "I've slept on worse," he assured her with a small smile. "Much worse, during the cattle drive." Violet looked as if she might argue further, but a yawn overtook her instead. The long day of riding had clearly taken its toll. She nodded gratefully and moved to the cot, sitting on the edge to remove her shoes. Flynn busied himself banking the fire for the night, trying to give her what privacy the small space allowed. He laid his bedroll on the floor, positioning himself between the cot and the door, an unconscious protective gesture. As the fire dimmed to a soft glow, Flynn became acutely aware of Violet's presence in the darkness, the sound of her breathing gradually deepening as she drifted toward sleep. "Flynn," her voice came softly through the darkness. "Yes. How will you get your ranch going without the money you spent on me?" Flynn considered his answer. "It'll take longer, that's all. I'll manage." A pause, then. "I wish I had some way to repay you. You don't owe me anything, Violet." "That's the whole point." Another pause, longer this time. Just as Flynn thought she might have fallen asleep, she spoke again, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Nobody's ever given me a choice before. I won't forget that." Flynn lay awake long after Violet's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep, listening to the storm and wondering at the strange turn his life had taken in the span of a day. He'd left Santa Rosa with most of his savings gone, and a woman he barely knew riding behind him. By any reasonable measure, he'd been foolish. Yet something about her presence in the small shack, the sound of her breathing across the room, felt oddly right, as if a piece had fallen into place that he hadn't known was missing. The storm passed during the night and dawn broke clear and fresh, the landscape washed clean by the rain. Flynn woke to find Violet already up, attempting to revive the fire. Her hair, freed from its tight knot, fell in loose waves down her back as she bent over the hearth. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. She straightened, turning to face him with a small, uncertain smile. "Good morning. I hope I didn't wake you." "No, it's time to be up anyway if we want to make good distance today." Flynn rose, folding his bedroll with practiced efficiency. They shared a breakfast of coffee and the last of the hardtack, then prepared to set out again. Outside, puddles from the night's rain dotted the ground, and the air held the clean scent of wet earth and pine. "The nearest town is about half a day's ride," Flynn explained as he saddled Rusty. "We can get a proper meal there, maybe some supplies." Violet nodded, shielding her eyes against the bright morning sun as she looked northward. "Does it have a name, this town?" "Cedar Junction. It's small but decent enough. I've stopped there before on cattle drives." As they rode, Flynn found Violet more talkative than the previous day, as if the storm and their shared confidences had broken down some barrier between them. She asked questions about his ranch, how large it was, what he raised, how long he'd had it. "It's modest," Flynn admitted. 40 acres, mostly for grazing. I run about 30 head of cattle and keep a few horses. Been mine for 2 years now. And you work it alone, so far. Been saving to expand, maybe hire help." He didn't mention that those savings were what he'd used to buy her freedom. "It sounds peaceful," Violet said, a wistfulness in her voice that made Flynn glance back at her. "It is, mostly. Lonely sometimes, but peaceful." They reached Cedar Junction by early afternoon. It was indeed a small settlement, a single main street lined with the essential businesses of a frontier town. A general store, a blacksmith's forge, a small hotel, and, inevitably, a saloon. Flynn felt Violet tense behind him as they rode past the saloon, her hands tightening momentarily on his waist. Without comment, he steered Rusty toward the hotel at the opposite end of the street. "We'll get a hot meal and rooms for the night," he said as they dismounted. "You must be saddle sore by now." Violet nodded gratefully, stretching her stiff limbs. "I'd forgotten how hard riding can be when you're not used to it." The hotel was simple but clean, run by a middle-aged couple who greeted them with friendly curiosity. Flynn requested 2 rooms and asked about meals. "Dining room opens at 6, the proprietress informed them. "But I could have hot water sent up now if you'd like to wash off the trail dust." Violet's face lit up at the suggestion. "That would be wonderful, thank you." As they climbed the stairs to their rooms, which were adjacent to each other, Flynn noticed Violet studying the hotel with interest, the modest furnishings, the faded but clean wallpaper, the worn carpet runner in the hallway. "It's been years since I stayed somewhere." "Respectable," she said quietly as they reached their doors. Flynn felt a surge of anger at the circumstances that had led to her imprisonment at the Golden Horseshoe, but kept his voice gentle. "Well, you deserve better than what you had. This is just the start." Violet's eyes met his, a complex emotion in their depths that Flynn couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said simply, then disappeared into her room. Left alone in the narrow hallway, Flynn stood for a moment, staring at her closed door. Something was happening to him, something unexpected and powerful. He'd set out to free a woman from an unjust situation, nothing more. He hadn't planned on feeling this growing connection, this pull toward her that strengthened with each passing hour. Shaking his head, Flynn entered his own room. A hot bath and a change of clothes would clear his head, he told himself. He was simply tired from the journey and the disruption to his plans. The hotel dining room was nearly empty when Flynn came down at 6 o'clock, wearing his cleanest shirt and having made an effort to tame his hair. He'd just taken a seat when Violet appeared in the doorway. She'd clearly made use of the hot water to wash her hair, which now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. The blue dress she'd worn from Santa Rosa, while simple, looked different somehow, perhaps because she wore it now as a free woman. Flynn rose automatically as she approached, pulling out a chair for her. "You look refreshed," he said, suddenly awkward. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Amazing what hot water and soap can do. They ordered the day's special beef stew with fresh bread and found themselves talking easily through the meal. Violet spoke of her childhood on the farm in Kansas, of her father's dreams to move west, and how his death had left her vulnerable to men like Sela's. "He found me working at a boarding house in Santa Fe," she explained, her eyes fixed on the table. "Offered me twice the wages to come serve at his saloon, said a pretty girl like me could make good money just serving drinks and smiling at customers." She gave a bitter laugh. "I was so naive." Flynn reached across the table impulsively, covering her hand with his. "You were young and alone. He was a predator." Violet looked up, surprised by the contact but not pulling away. "There were other girls at the saloon, most younger than me, all trapped the same way. I wonder what will happen to them." "You can't save everyone," Flynn said gently, "but maybe someday when you're on your feet you can find a way to help others." Violet turned her hand beneath his, her fingers curling slightly around his palm. "I'd like that." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Finally, Violet withdrew her hand, her eyes dropping to her plate. "Tell me about Colorado," she said, changing the subject. "What's it like where you live?" Flynn described his small ranch nestled in a valley with mountains visible to the west, the creek that ran through his property, the wildflowers that covered the meadows in spring. "It's nothing grand," he finished, "but it's mine. Land a man can stand on and call his own, that means something out here." "It sounds beautiful," Violet said softly, "like somewhere a person could breathe freely." After dinner, they walked briefly along the main street, the evening air cool but pleasant. The town was quiet. Most businesses closed for the night except the saloon, which they carefully avoided. As they returned to the hotel, Flynn found himself reluctant for the evening to end. Standing in the hallway between their rooms, he searched for something to say that might prolong their time together. "We should reach the Colorado border by tomorrow evening," he said finally. "Another day after that to my ranch, if all goes well." Violet nodded, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the hallway. "Flynn," she began, then hesitated. "Yes." She seemed to struggle with what she wanted to say. "I keep wondering why. Of all the saloons in all the towns in the territory, why did you walk into mine that night?" Flynn considered the question. "I've asked myself the same thing. Maybe it was chance, or maybe—" He trailed off, uncertain how to express the feeling that had been growing in him since he'd first seen her dance. "Maybe what?" Violet prompted. "Maybe some things are meant to happen," he finished simply. "Good night, Violet." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Good night, Flynn." In her room, Violet stood at the small window, looking out at the stars scattered across the vast western sky. For the first time in years, she felt the stirring of something like hope. Flynn Nolan was unlike any man she'd ever known, kind without expectation, strong without cruelty. And something else was happening, something she hadn't anticipated. When he touched her hand at dinner, she'd felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with gratitude. It both thrilled and terrified her. Violet had learned early and painfully not to trust men, not to believe in fairy tales where knights rescued maidens without expecting payment. Yet here was Flynn, who had given everything to free her and asked nothing in return. As she prepared for bed, Violet wondered what awaited her in Colorado. Would she find work in the town Flynn had mentioned? Would she finally build a life that was truly her own? And what of these feelings growing within her for the quiet cowboy who had rescued her? Sleep came slowly, her mind filled with possibilities that just days ago would have seemed impossible dreams. The next morning dawned clear and bright. After a hearty breakfast, Flynn and Violet set out once more, the rhythm of their journey now familiar and comfortable. Violet found herself more at ease on horseback, her body adapting to the motion as memories of childhood riding lessons returned. They talked as they rode about books they'd read, places they'd seen or hoped to see, small details of their lives that gradually filled in the picture of who they were. Flynn spoke of his time as a Union soldier despite his youth, the horrors he'd witnessed at Gettysburg, and his determination afterward to find a peaceful corner of the world. "That's why the ranch means so much," he explained. "After so much death and chaos, I needed to create something, to grow something." "I understand that," Violet said. "After my father died, I used to dream about having a small piece of land, just a garden, really where I could plant things and watch them thrive." "No reason you can't have that still," Flynn said. "Plenty of land in Colorado for those willing to work it." As they approached the Colorado border late that afternoon, the landscape began to change subtly, the mesas giving way to rolling foothills, the vegetation growing denser. They made camp that night beside a small stream, the gurgle of water over rocks a soothing backdrop to their evening. Flynn built a fire and prepared a simple meal from supplies purchased in Cedar Junction. As they sat by the fire after eating, the night settling around them like a blanket, Violet found herself studying Flynn's profile in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows as he stared into the flames. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Flynn glanced up, a small smile touching his lips. "Tomorrow, showing you my home. Are you nervous about it?" Violet asked, sensing something beneath his words. He considered the question. "A bit, maybe. It's a simple place, nothing fancy." "After where I've been, simple sounds perfect." Violet wrapped her arms around her knees. "I keep thinking this might be a dream, that I'll wake up back at the Golden Horseshoe with Silas shouting at me to get ready for the night's performance." "It's not a dream," Flynn assured her. "You're free now." Violet stared into the fire. "Free," she repeated, testing the word. "I'm not sure I know what that means anymore, to be truly free." "It means making your own choices," Flynn said. "Deciding your own path, no one telling you what to do or who to be." "Is that what you have? Complete freedom?" Flynn considered this. "As much as anyone gets, I suppose. We all have constraints: money, responsibilities, the land itself demanding certain things in certain seasons." He smiled slightly. "But yes, I answer to myself at the end of the day." "It sounds wonderful," Violet said wistfully. "It can be lonely," Flynn admitted, his voice quieter now. "Freedom sometimes means solitude." Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared loneliness, of the human need for connection. The moment was broken by a distant howl, a coyote calling to its pack. Flynn stood, adding more wood to the fire. "We should get some rest. Long ride tomorrow to reach the ranch." They prepared their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. The propriety Flynn had been raised with, demanding at least this much decorum despite the intimacy of their travels. As they settled for the night, Violet's voice came softly through the darkness. "Flynn." "Yes, thank you." "For everything." Flynn gazed up at the stars, brilliant in the clear Colorado sky. "You're welcome, Violet." Morning came with a light mist rising from the stream and birds calling to each other in the trees. They broke camp efficiently, the routine of travel now familiar between them. As they rode through the day, the landscape grew increasingly beautiful, pine-covered hills giving way to small valleys, meadows dotted with wildflowers, and always the distant mountains drawing them onward. By late afternoon, Flynn pointed ahead to a valley nestled between gentle hills. "There it is, home." Violet leaned forward, eager for her first glimpse of Flynn's ranch. As they crested a small rise, the valley opened up before them. A modest cabin stood near a grove of trees, a barn and corral nearby. A creek wound through the property, and beyond it, cattle grazed peacefully on green pastures. "It's beautiful," Violet breathed, taking in the tranquil scene. Flynn's expression softened with pride as he surveyed his land. "It's not much compared to some spreads, but it's mine. Paid for it fair and square." They rode down into the valley, the horses' hooves making little sound on the soft earth. As they approached the main cabin, Flynn pointed to a smaller structure about 100 yards away, near the tree line. "That's the second cabin I mentioned, built it last year for a hired hand, but never got around to finding one. It's simple but sound. You're welcome to stay there as long as you need." Violet studied the small cabin with its porch and chimney, a sense of possibility washing over her. A place of her own, however temporary the thought, was almost overwhelming after years of having nothing that truly belonged to her. Flynn helped her dismount in front of the main house, both of them stiff from the long journey. "Let me show you around, then get you settled." The tour was brief. Flynn's cabin was modest but well built, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a table with chairs. A door led to his bedroom, and shelves along one wall held books more than Violet would have expected in a cowboy's home. "You read a lot," she observed, running her finger along the spines. Flynn nodded. "Winter nights are long out here. Books help pass the time." After showing her the barn and corrals where a few horses gazed at them curiously, Flynn led Violet to the smaller cabin. He unlocked the door and stepped back, allowing her to enter first. The interior was plain but clean: one room with a small iron stove for heat and cooking, a narrow bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a chest for storing clothes. A window on each wall let in light and offered views of the surrounding landscape. "It's perfect," Violet said softly, turning in a small circle to take it all in. "It needs a woman's touch," Flynn said, then flushed slightly at his own words. "I mean, it could use some brightening up." Violet smiled, understanding. "Some curtains, perhaps. Maybe flowers when they're in season." Flynn nodded, relieved she hadn't taken offense. "I'll bring your bag over and get a fire started. You must be tired after our journey." "Actually," Violet said, surprising herself with her boldness, "I feel more alive than I have in years." Their eyes met, and Flynn felt that now familiar tug, the connection that had been growing between them since that first night in Santa Rosa. "We should celebrate," he said impulsively. "Your first night of true freedom. I have some decent coffee and even a tin of peaches I've been saving for a special occasion." Violet's smile widened. "I'd like that." They shared a simple but celebratory meal in Flynn's cabin that evening. Afterward, as darkness fell, Flynn lit a lamp and moved it to the center of the table. "There's something I've been wondering," he said, his voice quiet in the peaceful evening. "That first night when I saw you at the saloon, you were dancing, but your eyes were so sad. Was there ever a time when you danced for joy?" Violet looked down at her hands, remembering. "When I was a child, my mother loved music. She had a small music box my father had given her, and we would dance around our kitchen to its melody." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "After she died, I still danced sometimes when I was alone. It was a way to feel close to her." "And then Silas took even that from you," Flynn said, understanding in his voice. "Made something beautiful into something degrading." Violet nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Yes." Flynn stood suddenly, moving to a small trunk in the corner of the room. He rummaged through it before returning with something in his hand, a small, slightly tarnished music box. "It was my mother's," he explained, placing it carefully on the table. "I haven't opened it in years." He wound the key and lifted the lid. A sweet, clear melody filled the cabin, simple but beautiful in the quiet evening. Flynn stood and extended his hand to Violet. "Would you dance with me? Not for coins or for men's entertainment, but just for joy." Violet stared at his outstretched hand, emotions warring within her. For so long, dancing had been associated with shame, with being watched by leering men. Yet before that, it had been her greatest happiness. Slowly, she placed her hand in Flynn's. He drew her gently to her feet and into the center of the room, where the lamplight cast a warm glow around them. At first, their movements were awkward, constrained by uncertainty and the small space. But as the music played on, something changed. Violet felt the familiar rhythm flow through her, but this time without fear or shame, just the pure pleasure of movement, of being held respectfully in strong arms. Flynn watched in wonder as Violet transformed before his eyes. The wariness that had shadowed her features since he'd met her seemed to melt away, replaced by a luminous joy that took his breath away. Her movements grew more fluid, more confident, guiding him in a simple waltz around the small room. When the music finally wound down, they stood still, facing each other in the lamplight, hands still joined, breathing slightly faster than normal. Something had shifted between them, a barrier falling away, a trust established. "Thank you," Violet whispered, her eyes shining with emotion, "for giving dancing back to me." Flynn raised his hand to her cheek, his touch feather light. "You were always meant to dance for joy, Violet, never for men's coins." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Flynn's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. Violet answered by rising slightly on her toes, her face tilting up to his. Their lips met in a kiss so gentle it was barely a touch, a beginning, a promise, a healing. When they parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I didn't plan for this," he admitted softly, "for feeling this way about you." "Nor I," Violet whispered. "I wasn't looking for this for you." Flynn stepped back slightly, still holding her hands in his. "I want you to know something. What I feel for you, it changes nothing about your freedom. The cabin is yours for as long as you want it. If you choose to go to town, find work, build your own life apart from me, that's your right. I'll help you however I can." Violet studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "What if I want to stay, not just in the cabin, but with you?" "Nothing would make me happier," Flynn said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I want it to be your choice. A real choice, not made from gratitude or obligation." Violet nodded, understanding the gift he was giving her, not just freedom from Sila's, but the freedom to choose her own path, even if that path led away from Flynn. "I should go," she said finally, reluctantly withdrawing her hands from his. "It's been a long day," Flynn nodded, stepping back to give her space. "Of course, I'll walk you to your cabin." The night air was cool as they crossed the short distance between the two buildings, the moon casting enough light to guide their way. At her door, Violet turned to face Flynn. "Good night," she said softly, "and thank you for the dance." Flynn smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Violet's heart beat faster. "First of many, I hope." As she closed the door behind her, Violet leaned against it, her fingers touching her lips where Flynn's had been moments before. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future not just surviving, but living. Dancing not for coins, but for joy. In his own cabin, Flynn sat at his table, the music box open before him, though its melody had long since faded. He'd gone to Santa Rosa to sell cattle, and had returned with something far more precious, a woman who made him feel things he'd thought were lost to him forever. But with those feelings came responsibility. He meant what he'd said to Violet: her freedom had to be real, her choices her own. He would not be another man who controlled her, no matter how different his intentions might be from Silas's. Days passed, settling into a rhythm as Violet adjusted to life on the ranch. Flynn showed her the property, taught her about the cattle and horses, and helped her make the small cabin her own. They rode into Willow Creek for supplies, where Flynn introduced her simply as Miss Gardner, my new neighbor, allowing her to establish her own identity in the small community. Violet found unexpected pleasure in the simple tasks of ranch life, gathering eggs from the small chicken coop Flynn maintained, tending a kitchen garden she started beside her cabin, even learning to ride properly on a gentle mare Flynn gave to her use. "She's yours now," he said when Violet protested the generosity. "Every person needs a way to get around out here. Consider her a belated welcome gift." In the evenings, they often shared meals, sometimes at Flynn's cabin, sometimes at Violet's as she gained confidence in her cooking skills. After dinner, they might read aloud from Flynn's collection of books or simply talk, learning each other's stories, dreams, and fears. And sometimes they danced. Flynn had taken to winding the music box without comment, extending his hand to Violet in what became a wordless ritual between them. Each time, Violet felt another small piece of herself heal, the joy of movement reclaiming what Silas and men like him had tried to corrupt. A month after her arrival at the ranch, Violet sat on the porch of her cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up to see Flynn walking toward her, his expression thoughtful. "Evening," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Mind some company?" Violet smiled, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Never." Flynn settled beside her, his gaze following hers to the sunset. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the soft rustle of wind in the pines. "I've been thinking," Flynn said finally. "The Willow Creek Founders' Day celebration is next weekend. There'll be a dance in the town square." Violet turned to look at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Are you asking me to accompany you, Mr. Nolan?" Flynn's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I believe I am, Miss Gardner. But only if you want to." Violet considered the invitation. The thought of dancing in public again brought a momentary flutter of anxiety, memories of the golden horseshoe threatening to intrude. But this would be different, a community gathering, with Flynn beside her. "I'd like that," she said finally. "Very much." Flynn's smile widened. "Good, that's good." Another comfortable silence fell between them, but Violet sensed Flynn had more on his mind. She waited, allowing him the space to find his words. "There's something else," he said eventually. "I've been offered a chance to buy the adjacent property, another 40 acres with good grazing land and water rights. The Petersons are moving back east, need to sell quickly." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Violet said, noting the conflicted expression on Flynn's face. He nodded slowly. "It is. Been wanting to expand for a while now, but what?" Flynn sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't have the money, not anymore." He didn't need to explain further. They both knew where his savings had gone. Violet felt a pang of guilt. "Because of me." "No," Flynn said firmly, turning to face her. "Because of a choice I made. A choice I've never regretted, not for a moment." Their eyes met, and Violet saw the truth of his words reflected there. Still, she couldn't help feeling responsible for his missed opportunity. "Is there another way?" she asked. "A loan, perhaps." Flynn shook his head. "Banks aren't eager to lend to small ranchers like me. I've tried before." "What about a partner? Someone to invest?" "Thought of that too. But finding the right partner, someone you can trust, who shares your vision, that's not easy." An idea began to form in Violet's mind, bold, perhaps even improper, but increasingly clear. What if? She began, then hesitated. What if what? What if I could help? Violet said, the words coming faster now. I've been working at the mercantile in town 3 days a week. Mrs. Wilson pays me fair wages and I have no expenses here. I've been saving every penny. Flynn's expression softened. That's kind, Violet, but your money is yours. You've earned it. You should use it to build your future. What if my future is here? Violet said quietly, holding his gaze. What if I want to invest in this land? With you, Flynn stared at her, surprise evident in his face. You'd want that, to tie yourself to this place too. To you, Violet finished for him. Yes, if you'll have me. The moment hung between them, fraught with possibility. Flynn reached across the space separating them, taking Violet's hand in his. I need to be sure, he said, his voice low and serious, that this is what you truly want. Not gratitude, not obligation, but your free choice. Violet turned her hand in his, their fingers intertwining. Flynn Nolan, from the moment you walked into that saloon, you've never treated me as anything but a free woman deserving of respect. You gave me choices when I had none. You taught me to dance for joy again. She took a deep breath. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Completely of my own free will and choice. Flynn's breath caught at her words. Slowly, he raised his free hand to her cheek, his touch reverent. I love you too, Violet Gardner. Have since I first saw you dance, even with sadness in your eyes. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their kiss was different from their first, no longer tentative but filled with certainty, with promise. When they parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. I don't have much to offer, he said softly. Just this land, this life. It's not always easy. It's everything I've ever wanted, Violet assured him. A place to belong, work that matters, and someone to dance with, not for coins but for joy. The Founders' Day celebration in Willow Creek was everything Flynn had described: festive, communal, and filled with the simple pleasures of frontier life. Tables laden with food lined the town square. Children raced in sack races and egg and spoon competitions. And as evening fell, lanterns were lit for the dancing to begin. Violet wore a new dress for the occasion, pale green with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, purchased with her own earnings from the mercantile. As she and Flynn approached the town square, she felt a flutter of nervousness. Everyone's looking at us, she whispered, noticing the curious glances from townsfolk. Flynn smiled reassuringly, placing his hand at the small of her back. They're just not used to seeing me with such beautiful company. The town band, consisting of a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica, struck up a lively tune as couples began to form sets for a country dance. Flynn led Violet toward the improvised dance floor, nodding greetings to neighbors and acquaintances as they went. Mr. Nolan, called Mrs. Wilson, Violet's employer at the mercantile. Good to see you at a social gathering for once. She winked at Violet. I see you've finally coaxed our most confirmed bachelor out of his shell, Miss Gardner. Violet felt herself blush. We both enjoy dancing, she said simply. Well, it's about time someone got him to enjoy something besides cattle and horses, Mrs. Wilson replied good-naturedly. You two make a handsome couple. As they moved away, Flynn squeezed Violet's hand gently. Sorry about that. Small towns and their gossip. I don't mind, Violet assured him. It's nice to be seen as respectable. Flynn's expression sobered. You've always been respectable, Violet, no matter what circumstances forced you to do. The music changed to a waltz and Flynn led Violet onto the dance floor. As they joined the other couples, Violet felt a momentary hesitation. The last time she danced in public, it had been on the stage of the Golden Horseshoe, men's eyes following her every move with predatory interest. Flynn sensed her unease. Look at me, he said softly. Just me. Violet met his gaze and found there all the reassurance she needed. As they began to move to the music, the crowd around them seemed to fade away. There was only Flynn, his hand warm at her waist, his eyes never leaving hers as he guided her through the steps. They danced every dance that evening, energetic reels that left them breathless with laughter, stately promenades that allowed them to converse as they moved, and waltzes that brought them close enough to feel each other's heartbeat. With each turn around the floor, Violet felt another layer of her past fall away, replaced by the joy of dancing freely, with a man who respected her, who loved her. Later, as they walked home under a canopy of stars, Violet's hand tucked securely in the crook of Flynn's arm, she felt a contentment she'd never expected to experience. "Thank you for tonight," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Flynn glanced down at her, moonlight silvering his features. "For what? For dancing with me in public. For not being ashamed to be seen with someone who—" Flynn stopped, turning to face her. "Don't," he said firmly. "Don't finish that sentence. I'm proud to be seen with you, Violet Gardner." "Prouder than I've ever been of anything in my life." Violet blinked back sudden tears. "Even after everything I've done." "Everything that was done to you," Flynn corrected gently. "There's a difference. And yes, even then. Especially then, because it shows how strong you are to have survived with your spirit intact." He drew her close, his arms encircling her waist. "When I look at you, I don't see your past. I see the woman I love, brave, kind, and determined to build a new life. The woman I want to share my future with." As if to seal his words, he kissed her beneath the vast Colorado sky, stars witnessing their pledge to each other. The autumn days grew shorter, the nights cooler, as Flynn and Violet worked together to prepare the ranch for winter. With the combined savings from Violet's work at the mercantile and Flynn's careful budgeting, they made an offer on the Peterson property. It was less than the asking price, but with winter approaching and the Petersons eager to reach their daughter's home in Ohio before snow closed the mountain passes, the offer was accepted. One bright October morning, they rode to the boundary of their newly expanded property. Standing on a small rise that overlooked the additional 40 acres, Flynn put his arm around Violet's shoulders. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice reflecting both pride and a touch of awe at what they'd accomplished together. Violet surveyed the land, rolling pastures, a stand of pines, and a small pond fed by the same creek that ran through Flynn's original property. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "and it's ours." Flynn turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Violet," he began, his voice suddenly serious, "when I say ours, I mean it in every way. I want to build a life with you, not as my hired help or my business partner, but as my wife." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "If you'll have me." Violet felt her heart swell with emotion. Despite the growing closeness between them, the love they'd acknowledged, Flynn had never presumed upon their relationship. Even now, he was giving her a choice. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Flynn Nolan." His face broke into a smile of such joy that Violet felt momentarily breathless. He swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her in a circle that made her laugh with delight. "When?" he asked as he set her down, keeping his arms around her waist. "Soon," Violet replied, smiling up at him. "Before winter sets in fully. Just a simple ceremony with the people from town who have been kind to us." Flynn nodded, already envisioning their future. "And after? Will you move into the main house with me?" "Of course," Violet said, then added with a mischievous smile, "though I've grown quite fond of my little cabin." "We could keep it," Flynn suggested. "As a guest house, perhaps. Or someday, when we have children who are old enough, a place for them to have adventures while still being close to home. Violet's expression softened at the mention of children. "You want a family? With you, yes," Flynn said simply. "A home filled with laughter and music and dancing." Violet rose on her tiptoes to kiss him, sealing their agreement. "A home where no one dances for coins," she whispered against his lips, "only for joy." They were married on a crisp November day in the small church in Willow Creek. Violet wore a dress of deep blue, with a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers gathered by the Wilson children. Flynn, in his best suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such reverence that several of the townswomen were seen dabbing at their eyes before the ceremony even began. The reception was held at the town hall, with tables groaning under the weight of dishes contributed by neighbors' roast venison, fresh bread, pies of every description. The band from the Founders' Day celebration provided music, and as the evening progressed, Flynn led Violet onto the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. As they moved together to the gentle strains of a waltz, Flynn bent to whisper in Violet's ear, "Happy." Violet looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible." They departed for their ranch amid cheers and well wishes, riding home beneath a sky ablaze with stars. Flynn had prepared the main house for Violet's arrival, adding small touches to make it feel like their home rather than just his fresh curtains at the windows, a quilt made by Mrs. Wilson for their bed, wildflowers in a vase on the table. As they crossed the threshold together, Flynn swept Violet into his arms, carrying her inside with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nolan," he said softly, setting her down in the center of the room. Violet looked around at what was now their shared home, feeling a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. "It's perfect," she whispered. Later, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting silvery patterns across their entwined forms, Violet marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the despair of the golden horseshoe to the joy of Flynn's arms, it seemed almost impossible, yet here she was. "What are you thinking?" Flynn asked, his voice drowsy with contentment as he traced patterns on her bare shoulder. Violet nestled closer to him, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "That life can change in an instant," she said softly. "That sometimes miracles happen in the most unexpected ways." Flynn's arms tightened around her. "You're my miracle, Violet Nolan." "And you're mine," she replied, raising her head to look into his eyes. "My cowboy who took me away to dance only for joy." The winter passed in a blur of contentment for the newlyweds. Snow blanketed the ranch in white, creating a peaceful isolation that allowed them to build the foundations of their marriage away from the world's eyes. They developed routines and rituals that sustained them through the cold months. Flynn, tending to the cattle and horses, ensuring they had shelter and feed. Violet making their cabin a true home with her cooking and handwork. In the evenings, they would read to each other from Flynn's collection of books, discuss plans for the expanded ranch, or simply sit in comfortable silence before the fire. And sometimes, when the day's work was done and the lamps turned low, Flynn would wind the music box and they would dance in the center of their small home, finding in each other's arms a joy neither had thought possible. With spring came new beginnings. The land reawakened after winter's sleep, meadows carpeted with wildflowers, the creek running high with snowmelt. Violet planted an expanded garden, adding flowers to the practical vegetables and herbs. Flynn began work on enlarging their herd, trading with neighbors and making a trip to Denver to purchase additional cattle. And in late April, as the first calves were being born on the ranch, Violet shared news of her own. "Flynn," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, noting the mixture of nervousness and joy in her expression. "What is it, love?" Violet took his hand, placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby. Come autumn." Flynn's face transformed with wonder. For a moment he seemed unable to speak, his eyes searching hers to confirm he'd understood correctly. "A baby," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "We're having a baby." Violet nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday when I went to town. Around October, he thinks." Flynn gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "Violet," he whispered against her hair, "thank you for this gift, for your love, for everything." The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipations. Flynn added a room to their cabin, working tirelessly to create a nursery before winter returned. Violet sewed tiny garments in the evenings, singing softly to the child growing within her. Their neighbors, upon hearing the news, contributed baby quilts, handmade toys, and plenty of advice for the expectant parents. October arrived with its golden light and crisp air. The ranch's expanded herd had done well over the summer, and the harvest from Violet's garden had been abundant. As they prepared for both winter and the baby's arrival, Flynn found himself watching Violet with increasing concern, noting her fatigue, the occasional wince of discomfort she tried to hide. "Perhaps we should stay in town, closer to Dr. Miller for the last few weeks," he suggested one evening as he massaged her swollen feet. Violet shook her head, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "I want our child born here in our home. Besides, Mrs. Wilson has delivered dozens of babies over the years. She's promised to come stay with us when the time is near." Flynn wasn't entirely convinced but respected Violet's wishes. He arranged for Mrs. Wilson to come to the ranch in mid-October, prepared to stay until the baby arrived. The child, however, had plans of its own. 3 days before Mrs. Wilson was due to arrive, Violet woke in the pre-dawn hours, her body gripped by the unmistakable pains of labor. "Flynn," she gasped, clutching his arm. "It's time." Flynn was instantly alert, years of handling ranch emergencies serving him well despite his personal panic. He helped Violet through the early stages, heating water, preparing clean linens, and sending their ranch hand, young Tom, whom they'd hired that summer, to fetch both Mrs. Wilson and Dr. Miller if possible. The labor progressed rapidly. By mid-morning, Violet's pains were coming close together, her face pale with exertion and pain. Flynn stayed by her side, wiping her brow, supporting her back, murmuring encouragement. "I'm scared," Violet admitted during a brief respite between contractions. "What if something goes wrong? What if I can't do this?" Flynn took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "You are the strongest person I know, Violet Nolan. You've survived things that would break most people. You can do this." He smiled, trying to lighten her fear. "Besides, our child is clearly impatient to join us. Takes after its mother in that regard." Violet managed a small laugh, which turned into a grimace as another contraction seized her. "Flynn," she gasped, I think it's coming now." Flynn swallowed hard, steeling himself. Mrs. Wilson hadn't arrived and there was no time to wait. He would have to deliver their child himself. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let's bring our baby into the world." What followed was the most intense experience of Flynn's life. Guided by Violet's instincts and his own limited knowledge gleaned from helping birth countless calves and foals, he helped her through the final stages of labor. When at last their child slipped into his waiting hands, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair, Flynn felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "We have a son," he said, his voice breaking as he carefully placed the squalling infant on Violet's chest. "A perfect, healthy son." Violet's face, exhausted but radiant, crumpled with joy as she gazed down at their child. "Hello, little one," she whispered, running a gentle finger over the baby's cheek. "We've been waiting for you, Mrs. Wilson." Arrived an hour later, full of apologies for her absence but impressed by Flynn's handling of the delivery. She helped Violet bathe and settle comfortably with the baby, then showed Flynn how to swaddle his son properly. "What will you call him?" she asked as the three of them admired the sleeping infant. Flynn looked to Violet, who nodded encouragingly. They had discussed names during the long summer evenings, considering family traditions and personal preferences. "Frederick," Flynn said softly, "after my father, Frederick James Nolan." "A good, strong name," Mrs. Wilson approved, "for a good, strong boy." That night, after Mrs. Wilson had retired to the guest cabin and baby Frederick was sleeping peacefully in the cradle Flynn had crafted, husband and wife lay close together in their bed, exhausted but too filled with wonder to sleep. "Thank you," Flynn whispered into the darkness, his arm protectively around Violet's shoulders. "For what?" she asked, her voice drowsy. "For Frederick. For choosing to stay here with me. For making this ranch a home." He paused, overcome. "For everything." Violet turned her face to his, her eyes shining in the moonlight that filtered through their window. "And thank you, Flynn Nolan, for giving me a life I never dared to dream of." As if in response, the baby stirred in his cradle, making small sounds that immediately drew their attention. Flynn rose to check on him, lifting the tiny form with hands that had once seemed too large and rough for such delicate work, but now moved with natural confidence. "He's just stretching," Flynn reported, settling back beside Violet with their son cradled against his chest. Getting comfortable in his new world. Violet watched them together, her husband and son silhouetted against the moonlit window, and felt a completeness she had never known was possible. From the darkness of the Golden Horseshoe to this moment of perfect contentment, her journey had been one of both struggle and unexpected blessing. As Frederick nestled against his father's chest, his tiny hand curling around Flynn's finger, Violet made a silent promise to herself, to Flynn, and to their son. Their child would grow up knowing only love and security, dancing for joy in meadows filled with wildflowers, his spirit as free as the Colorado sky. And on quiet evenings, when the day's work was done, she would tell him the story of how his father had rescued a dancer who had lost her joy, and how together they had built a life filled with love, music, and the freedom to choose their own path. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the Nolan Ranch. Frederick, now called Freddie by everyone, except his grandmother Wilson, grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's grace of movement. The ranch prospered under Flynn and Violet's joint management, expanding to include a small orchard and several more head of cattle. And in the spring of Freddie's 4th year, the family welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose. Named for both grandmothers the children would never meet, but whose spirits lived on in the stories Flynn and Violet shared. On a warm summer evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Nolan family gathered on the porch of their home. Flynn sat in a rocking chair, baby Elizabeth sleeping against his shoulder, while Violet watched Freddie demonstrate a new dance he'd created, a chaotic combination of hops, spins, and stomps that made both parents struggle to contain their laughter. "And then you go like this," Freddie exclaimed, executing a particularly enthusiastic jump that nearly sent him tumbling. "Careful, sweetheart," Violet cautioned, though her eyes shone with amusement. "That's a very energetic dance." "It's a happy dance," Freddie explained seriously. "For when you're so happy you can't keep still." Flynn's eyes met Violet's over their son's head, a wealth of shared memories and understanding passing between them. "Those are the best kind," Flynn said softly. As twilight deepened into evening, they moved inside. Flynn settled Elizabeth in her cradle while Violet helped Freddie prepare for bed, listening to his prayers and the rambling account of his day's adventures. When both children were asleep, Flynn and Violet stood in the doorway of the nursery, arms around each other, watching the peaceful rise and fall of their children's breathing. "Did you ever imagine this?" Violet whispered, leaning her head against Flynn's shoulder. "That night in Santa Rosa, did you ever think we'd end up here?" Flynn pressed a kiss to her temple. "I hoped," he admitted. "From the moment I saw you dance, I hoped for something I couldn't quite name, something that looked a lot like this." They moved to the main room, where the lamps burned low and the night's quiet surrounded them. On the mantel sat the music box, tarnished now, but still functional, still precious for the memories it held. Without a word, Flynn wound it and lifted the lid. The familiar melody filled the room, the same tune that had accompanied their first dance in this cabin, when Violet was newly frayed and uncertain of her future. Flynn extended his hand, a gesture that had become a cherished ritual between them. "Dance with me." Violet placed her hand in his, allowing him to draw her into the center of the room. As they moved together to the music, their steps practiced and perfectly matched after years of dancing together, Violet reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the Golden Horseshoe, where she had danced for men's coins, her spirit dimming with each performance, to this home filled with love and laughter, where she danced only for joy, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Yet it had happened one choice at a time, one day at a time, with Flynn beside her, believing in her freedom even when she'd forgotten how to believe in it herself. The music wound down, but they continued to sway together in the center of the room, reluctant to break the spell of the moment. "I love you, Violet Nolan," Flynn murmured against her hair. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." Violet raised her face to his, eyes shining in the lamplight. "And I love you, Flynn Nolan, for giving me freedom, for teaching me to dance again, for the life we've built together." As their lips met in a kiss both tender and passionate, Violet felt the familiar surge of gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought Flynn to the Golden Horseshoe that night, the cowboy who had taken her away to dance only for joy, and in doing so, had given her the greatest gift of all, the freedom to love and be loved, wholly and without reservation. Outside, stars emerged one by one in the vast Colorado sky, witnesses to the life that had blossomed from the most unlikely of beginnings, a dance floor in a dusty saloon, where a woman's spirit had refused to be broken, and a man had recognized the music still playing in her heart.